We'll see shortly. That's okay. What is this? The coffee table. The coffee table.
Oh my goodness. Dobby hair.
Yeah.
My goodness.
Thank you. One has the daga in it and one has the daga in it.
Yeah. It's not so easy to know which is which. Because this thing is so damn big.
This loss will be the checkup visit. We'll use this as a visit checkup.
Oh, you're going to play it like this?
Yeah. Sit on that.
Because it's a lower level.
Yeah, it's okay. It's just a basic demonstration, nothing fancy.
They'll come to you and say hi. Hello. Sit. Hey. Sit. Down.
Test. Can you put your lapel back on? Just.
Down.
If you want to go down to see, you can. Okay. As you like. Hello. This is good. Do you speak something, please? Hello. Okay. Hello, test. Hello, test. Oh, you're not on it, that's why. Let me switch it. Is the middle? Hello. There we go. It's good? Yes. Speak, please. Hello. Test. Can you hear me? Test.
Very
Very good. Test 1, 2. Yourself. Wow, no matter how small the audience is, there's always this moat that happens. It's a scary person.
Test.
আপনি এখানে বসবেন? হ্যাঁ, তাই তাই বলছিলাম আর কি।
I was wishing I
टोपी It's got a big head.
Good evening and welcome everyone to the first Ragadari lecture series. The hope is that you have all come here today having listened to the first part of, so the way it'll work is the Ragadari series, every rag will have a chapter and every chapter will have different parts to it. The first part got posted last week where Guruji demonstrated the rag that we are going to discuss today, Rag Abhir as a Drupad. So hopefully you have all had a chance to listen to that. And today we will have a discussion with Sima Guru Arijit Mahalanavis on that rag, its history, its evolution. And so this is the next part in that series. So welcome to the very first one, chapter 1, Rag Abhir. So for in today's discussion, we'll be discussing Rag Abhir, and I just wanted to ask Guruji to maybe shed some light on, assuming that we all have heard the Rag already, just shed some light on the history or the origins of the Raga, how it came to be, how did you discover it, and take it from there.
The only real mention of the Rag Abhir that I found is in a work by T.V. Subbarao called Bharatiya Sangeet Raganidhi. And it basically has a half-page entry on this rag called Abhir, which Subbarao indicates is essentially looks like the scale of Bhim Palasi but uses a komalda. In addition, there is in the literature, there's one composition that's available, and that's available in Marifun Nagamat, and is attributed to Bhatkande. So that's what is available. That's not a lot. One way to look at things is to understand that the name Abhir sounds very much like Abhiri. Right? They seem to share an etymological root. And Abhiri is a very important raga of Carnatic music. Now, when we look at raga Abhiri, there are many compositions, but really there are two that are of importance to us. One is the very famous Tyagaraja Kriti Nagmumu, and the other is a Dikshita Kriti called Vinabheri. Vinabheri is not sung very often, but Nagumumu is. Now, in the recorded history of Rag Abhiri in South India, the indication is that in earlier times, the raga used to be sung with a komal dham. Right? So clearly we have 2 points now where things seem to line up. The name Abhir and the name Abhiri look very similar, and they seem to have shared a scale in the distant past, or maybe not so distant past. There are recorded examples of Nagumomo being sung with a komalda, and the few times that I have heard Veenaveri being sung, it's always sung with a komalda. So that leads us to believe that one of two things has happened. Either this rag existed in both the systems of music, and in Carnatic music it got altered, right? The komalda went away, it became a shuddha, and today when you hear Nagumomo and you listen to most kritis in Abheri, it looks very much like Bhimpalasi, right? So it may have become altered in Carnatic music to look like Bhimpalasi. There's another raga, and just incidentally, just to cover our bases, there's another raga in Carnatic music called Karnataka Deva Gandhari, which is supposed to look very much like Bhimpalasi. It has the same notes, the same scalar structure. So in the past, now there isn't a distinction being made between Karnataka Deva Gandhari and Abhiri, but in the past they were considered distinct entities. Therefore, all of this is circumstantial evidence that lends credence to the idea that Abheri in the past used a komaldha and probably shares an ancestry with the Hindustani raga Abhir. Now, having said all that, as I said, there's very little evidence in the Hindustani literature to suggest that this raga even existed. And the scant literature that does exist, like I said, the only available composition is attributed to Bhatkande. Now there's another theory that one can come up with on this front. Now we know that Bhatkande was deeply influenced and was very enamored of the organizational and sort of foundational structure and foundational solidity of Carnatic music, and he studied it very deeply. And it's quite possible that in his studies on Carnatic music, he came across this raga called Abheri and brought it into Hindustani music via this composition. One can get further credence, kind of give further credence to this idea, because in Marifun Nagamat, that composition is referred to as Abhiri, right? So it's possible that Abheri became Abhiri, and then the E got dropped and became Abhir. So either of these possibilities, it's not improbable that one of these is the history of this raga. Now, this one composition doesn't give us a lot. I'll sing it for you so you can hear it, and we can talk about it a little later after that. So this composition is a Jhaptal composition. धन सुगम पन सहित धन सुगम पन सहित धन संपुराण रक्त गण संपुराण रक्त गण आदर मुरली के सुन हरत चातरा को मन संग ले आभीर घन संग ले आभीर घन संग. So that's the material that we have to work with. That's it. When you're looking at a composition like this, okay, let me back up a bit. So, as I said, from a scalar perspective, the rag essentially looks like Bhimpalasi with a komal dha instead of a shuddha dha. So, the scale of it is ni sa ga ma pa ni sa ni da pa ma ga re sa. That's what it looks like as far as Aroha Avroha goes. Now, Subbarag additionally indicates that the Vadi of the Raga is Pa. Right, so the Vadi of the Raga is Pa, the Samvadi is probably Sa. Okay, Pa Sa. So that means that if this looks a lot like Bhimpalasi and it has that Pa Sa combination, it's actually close to Bhimpalasi's twin Raga, which is Dhanashri. Right, so if I sing Dhanashri, Re re na de na na this is what Dhanashri would look like. So one can theorize that based on what Subbarao was saying and based on the scalar structure, that this is like Dhanashri with a Komal Dha rather than Bhimpalasi. So that's one way of looking at things, but that's not where the story ends, is it? Why not?
I think the handful of us who have had the opportunity to learn this rag from you in earlier discussions, the way the rag was discussed at that point was very. It was either Bhimpalasi with Komaldha or Asavari with Bhimpalasi structure.
Mm.
So it was taught with the, so this is the first time that you are discussing the Dhanashri end of it that might be within that rag. So when you had earlier discussed the rag with us at that point in time, there was this Asavari Bhimpalasi sort of ideology going where there was a very strong, when you gave us Talim in the rag, there was a very strong element of Asavari. Um,
So that's correct. So I want to say two things about what Kishan has just said. One thing is that when you're dealing with aprachalit ragas like this, ragas that are not commonly heard, interpretation of structure becomes a very important aspect of exploration. And if you look at the literature, you'll find that for unknown ragas or lesser known ragas, oftentimes there's not one version, but two, three, four, five versions of the same raga. And part of that is because they are unexplored, there is no uh, popular mean for the raga. There's no way of looking at it and saying this is the mean structure of the raga, that this is what everybody is singing. So commonly these are the things that are defining of that raga. So part of the challenge in dealing with an aprachalit raga is to explore all possible avenues. And so based on what Kishan is saying, there are actually three different ways of looking at Abhir. So that's one thing I want to say. What was the other thing I wanted to say? The other thing I wanted to say was that classification of ragas is also a very important aspect of what we do. And this particular raga is classified as an Asavari That raga. And therefore, one has to go out of one's way to make sure that it fits within the That, right? So there are certain characteristics of that 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 have to be accounted for since it is a raga of the Asavari That. Do we all understand why it's Asavari That? Why? Because if I look at the tonal material of the raga, right, I've got Ani sa ga ma pa ni sa ni da pa ma ga re sa. So if instead of looking at the raga skipping re and dha going up, if I think about putting them back, what notes should I put back? I'd put back Shuddha Re and Komal Dha. Right? So if I have to make the rag Sampurna, sa re ga ma pa da ni sa ni da pa ma ga re sa. So the tonal material of the raga is to be drawn out of Asavari That. That's the scale of Asavari That. Therefore, when I present this raga, there should be some hint of Asavari in what I'm doing. There should be some hint that it belongs to that That. So how do I bring that in? If I look at this particular composition, ra, na, ri, ra, na, 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 ri, ra, na, ri, na, na, re, re, na, re, re. It's not until the very end that an Asavari phrase comes in, right? The very end, I see re, re, na, re, na. There, I have a little bit of Asavari. But in fact, when I look at the composition, I'm singing it wrong because what's written is re sa re ni da pa. The point is that this particular composition, when I analyze it from the perspective of where it's coming from, I see Dhanashri in ga ma pa da pa. Right? If it was Dhanashri, it would be re ra ra na na. And that's not there, it's Komalda. That's coming in from Dhanashri. It starts from Ma, kind of like the modern day Bhimpalasi. The Ma being important. Re, ra, na, ra, na, na. This is happening. Ra, na, na, di, na. Bhimpalasi. So this composition is demonstrating aspects of Dhanashri and Bhimpalasi, and it doesn't necessarily very strongly suggest Asavari. So, as a counterpoint, I've written a sargam that I would like to sing for you. Re na na dha pa dha ma pa pa sa dha pa dha pa, sorry, dha pa dha ma pa pa sa dha pa da da pa dha pa dha ma pa pa sa dha pa dha ma pa ma pa da pa ga re sa ga ma pa ni ni sa pa ga re sa ni da pa ma pa ga sa ga ma pa da ma pa sa da pa ma pa ni sa ga re sa pa ni sa ga re sa ga re sa ni da pa ma pa sa ni da pa ma ga sa ga ma pa sa ni da pa. Sorry, the antara is from the psalm. I'll sing the antara one more time. Ma pa ni sa ga re sa ma pa ni sa ga re sa ga re sa ni da pa ma pa sa ni da pa ma ga sa ga ma pa sa ni da pa ma pa sa da pa. Okay, so if you look at this composition carefully, you'll find there's a lot more Asavari going on, right? So sa da pa da pa ga re sa ga ma pa. The ga ma pa is not, but so one way to think about this is that if I look at the raga from an Arohi structure, then it suggests Dhanashri Vimpalasi very strongly. If I look at it from an Avrohi structure, it suggests Asavari very strongly. So how you want to interpret it is up to you. You can look at it as purely Dhanashri Vimpalasi, you can look at it purely as Asavari, you can look at it as a mix of things. Clearly, at some level, it's got to be a mix, but um, the beauty of working on Aprachalit ragas is when I sing it, I sing more Dhanashri Vimpalasi. When Kishan sings it, he sings it more Asavari. But that's an interpretation kind of thing. And both are Rag Abhir.
So I think this is an important point to be made, and this is a point that will come up multiple times throughout this series and these discussions, that um, there's a belief that rags have one swarup. There's a belief that across a ghanana, within one shishya parivar, within one branch of any line of gurus and their students, that a rag is to be preserved and presented one way, and that is the chap of that rag. So the way the guru sings it is the way the student sings it, and so on and so forth. Seeing as this series will have many anvat rags and many different rags, and rags that have so much scope for interpretation on behalf of every individual person who sings it, what are your thoughts on this particular phenomenon, and how do you feel differently about the situation, and if so, why?
I do. I feel very differently about it, and I'll give a couple of points on this. The first is that especially for Anvat ragas, for Aprachalit ragas, oftentimes our knowledge on these ragas is codified in compositions. In many of these rarer forms, there might be one composition or two compositions or three compositions. And that those compositions, because they have been written by great masters and have been sung by generations of masters, the form of that composition, at some point, it becomes very difficult to distinguish between what is the rag and what is the composition. This is particularly true in Carnatic music, actually, but it's also very true for the Anvat Aprachalit ragas of Hindustani music. And that is not that is so. I completely disagree with the idea that a composition should define a raga. Secondly, the analogy that I've always made and I'll continue to make is that a raga, a viable raga, a real raga, a strong raga that can be sung for a good period of time, has particular characteristics, particular, it's got a personality. It's like a person, right? And so you and I can know the same person. It's more than likely that that person, unless they're very unidimensional, is going to interact with us very differently, right? It's always a give and take. How I talk with Rashmi is going to be very different from how Kishan talks to Rashmi, or how Dobby interacts with Rashmi, or how Saili interacts with Rashmi. Everybody has a different way of interacting with Rashmi. And as a result, Rashmi will also interact differently, right? We interact or we respond to stimuli that we receive from others, right? And therefore, a raga, my intellectual formalization of it is going to be very different from how Kishan formalizes it, or any one of you formalizes it. Does that mean that there will be no relationship between how I look at the raga and how one of you looks at the raga? Of course not. Of course not. After all, I'm the one teaching it to you, right? There'll be things that you will pick up. No person is going to be completely different from, that's actually pathological if a person is different with everyone, that's really strange. That's not normal. So a raga is like that also, right? The raga has a core that is essential to it. But then how it interacts with you is very much a function of your understanding of its aesthetics and how you interpret what is there. So in order for a raga to be viable, let's think about the great ragas of Hindustani music. If we think about Malkauns, Darbari, Bihag, Yaman, Jaunpuri, all these big ragas, Des, every musician who has studied these things very carefully has her own way of looking at that raga, right? I mean, no two great recordings of the same raga are going to sound exactly the same. So why is it that an Aprachalit raga should sound the same from person to person to person to person? That doesn't make any sense. That answer the question?
Um, this is an Aprachalit raga. We've covered the phraseology and you've talked about the shape of the rag and its influences. At this juncture, there are two questions that come to mind, which aren't quite related to one another, but I'll ask them anyways. Based off of what you've said about how the rag has an influence, you can see it as Dhanashri, Bhimpalasi, you can see it as Asavari, Bhimpalasi, Asavari, Dhanashri, any combination thereof. Would this rag be qualified as a Jod rag?
There are different types of Jod rags. This can be thought of as one type of Jod rag. When we talk about Jod rags, there's a set of Jod rags, like for example Basant Bahar. this kind of a Jod rag has very defined regions that belong to one rag or the other. And it's quite literally, I'm juxtaposing the two next to each other. There's something slightly, and I think there's a negative connotation to this word. I don't want to carry the negativity of it, but there's slightly something schizophrenic about it, right? It's got a dual personality. Those are interesting, and oftentimes they can be very expansive. They can be very interesting. Um, Sometimes they're very small, right? And then there's a set of Jod rags, for example, like jokons. Re ra na 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 te na ri ra ri ra no ra. Now there Jog and Chandrakons have been melded in such a way that it has its own character, and you cannot really see the distinct. I mean, you can if you have studied these rags very carefully, you know exactly what phrase is coming from which rag. But the composite of it is an identity of its own. So I think that this rag is more like Jokons than it is like Basant Bahar, but it's such a unsung rag that it needs to be sung more, it needs to be performed more, it needs to be practiced more, it needs to be taught more for us to gain a common understanding of what that composite personality is. It is a Jodra, but of a sort.
Since we're on the topic of, you described there were three kinds of jodrags. Since it's been mentioned, could you just give an example of what the third type
Did
of?
I say there are three? There's actually more.
Okay, I take that back, but we can
We can do
tackle
a session
those
on Jodrags,
on
but essentially
jodrags.
there's Chaya Lagat Ragas, there are Mishra Ragas, uh, and then there's proper Jod Ragas like this, and there's different categories of these. So we'll talk about it
Sure,
somewhere.
sure. Okay, so bringing it back to understanding the rag, giving it a shape, and seeing it, as you mentioned, that this is an aprachalit rag, this is an anvat rag. It's not very commonly sung. There's very few sources on it. Uh, as I understand it, this rag was you found this rag in the texts that you have, especially Subbarao, and you've also mentioned the composition by Bhatkande in Maripurna Gamat and in Kramik Pustak Malika. Um, but there must be and as you also mentioned, there's no recordings. This is very limited literature on the raga. So I understand that you worked with your guru Shantaji to bring this rag into something, or bring some sense of understanding or structure to that raga. So can you discuss what that process was like, of taking it from a book or just a series of sentences that might describe that you can count on your fingers, and then one or two compositions, and turning that into what you've done? You've also written compositions with Shantaji, and you've expanded the rag and its literature quite a great deal. So what was that process like, and how did that?
Um, First of all, I would say that this was quite a while back, so my memories are a little bit foggy. Um, and if I remember correctly, I wasn't even aware of Bhatkande's Abhir composition at the time. Shantadi had a copy of Marihunnagamat, which she very kindly gave me. But that was much later, and it was quite coincidental that I saw it and went, "Oh, okay, so this exists." So literally, all we had was the blurb from Subbarao.
Subara.
What was the motivation for this? The motivation was essentially I sang the scale a few times, and to me it was very curious that if I have a Shuddha there, I'm able to create all these different varieties, right? Pimpalasi, Dhanashri, and then offshoots. So Dhanashri Ang is a whole large set of rags in Hindustani music. So this ang, if I just put a shuddha dha there, it creates a starting point for an ang that produces lots of different rags. So my curiosity was, why is it that one note causes this whole thing to be so obscure? So I um, I tried singing it. This was YouTube was around, but it wasn't widely available. I think I managed to get a hold of one recording of Musiri Subramania Iyer singing Abhedi in the old style. I heard it and I said I couldn't make heads or tails of what was being sung. I just, to my ear, it didn't sound coherent. And I think that was deeply influenced by the fact that um, I'd heard that composition very widely sung with the Shuddhada. So if that's what you're exposed to, and suddenly you get this recording, something's not sitting right, you know. So I was just very curious why something is non-viable because of one single note. So then I brought this to Shantadi's attention, and so you've been to her place. You know that a lot of our talim happened in two ways. One was in her music room, and where we would go back and forth um, working on a rag. She would correct me. She would teach me a composition. She would correct me, and then I'd understand something about it. And then a lot of our talim happened at her dinner table, right, where we'd sit and talk about what was on our brains musically. And that even to this day, when I go to Seattle, I find myself in that position sitting there, that I have a seat at that dining table, which is mine. And all our dialogue happens when I sit there and we talk about whatever the two of us are thinking. So this was definitely something that was on my mind and I had brought it up. And I asked her what she thought about trying to make this something more viable. And the composition that we came up with, which is the Drupad that is in the other recording, my thought on that was that um, the great composition of Carnatic music is Nagu Momo. Can we write a Drupad that looks like, content-wise, looks like Nagu Momo? So I got a translation of Nagu Momo, and I'm terrible at Hindi and Braj and whatever. So I came up with something, and I looked at it and I went, "That's terrible," but I gave it to her anyway, and she looked at it and said, "Oh, okay." Then we called her dear friend, Dr. Naseem Hines, who's an expert of Urdu and Braj. She's a great scholar of these languages, and I think my version was shared with her, and she was just very kind. And I was made aware that this is not a good piece of anything, which is good. But then, to my great amazement, the following week, I went back to Shantadi's, and she said, "I have something for you." So we sat at her dinner table, and she gave me this text, and this text was a translation of Nagumomu in her own poetry. So Shantadi is very underrated when it comes to her uh, language ability. She's just an amazing creative mind. And when it comes to language, she's got a command that is actually quite astounding. It's just that she doesn't make a big deal out of it. So, anyway, but she gave me this, and I took it home, and um, I think my conception of what the rag might look like was starting to solidify. And at some point, I said, "What the heck? Let me try and write music to this." And so I wrote it, and it turned out okay. I took it to Shandari the following week. I sang it for her, and she said, "Yeah, this is the way it ought to be." So that's my recollection of what happened. But also along the way, I also visited with Professor Ramesh Gangoli, a great scholar of music, as you know. We talked about this a little bit, and then we discussed having a few sessions where we all came up with our own compositions. So I remember he wrote a Lakshan Geet in this rag, which I don't have in my brain. It's gone. But he had a different perspective on it also. But so the three of us sat together, Shanta Diyai and Rameshji, and we all sang what we had. So these kinds of exchanges slowly sort of crystallized in my mind what I felt was the structure of the rag. So then the next thing that happened was I gave talim to you, I gave talim to Harkirat and Asavari, not the rag, the person. And after teaching you guys, my thoughts really consolidated and formed into this particular entity. So I think I like to believe that what was published this week was a good representation of a very coherent idea of this.
But that is still, as coherent as it is, it's still
If
open
anybody comes up with a completely different interpretation of this rag, I will be the happiest person.
So, one of the really unique things about being your student is that being your student, we get exposure to four major gharanas. We get exposure to Jaipur, Gwalior, Agra, and Kirana. And that's just for the Khayal side. Drupad side, there's many other styles as well. It's become fairly, as far as my understanding is concerned, it's become fairly well known that any given rag in any given gharana has a flavor of its own. It brings out a quality of that raga that might not exist in another gharana, and that's um, does that apply to this rag? Do you think that something like this applies to this rag where chalo, we've talked about Dhanashri, Pimpalasi, Asavari as the three major factors? Is Gayaki a factor in which rag comes out more or less in this particular case?
It's I don't feel that the Gayaki per se changes the rag in this particular case, but particular compositions evoke certain Gayakis.
Okay.
Right? So, for example, Sangali, you know, oops. Na 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 ra, na, na, because it has a strong Dhanashri ang. And in my ear, when I think of Dhanashri, Pandit K.G. Ginde's version really sits in my ear. So, ra, na, 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 re, ra, na, na, re, ra, na, Sangali abhiragana dhanga Sangali abhiragana gana dhanga abhiragana dhanga Jagaliya abhiragana Jagaliya abhiragana Jagaliya abhiragana Aliya abhiragana Yada nachada madana Yada Sangali Yabiragana Najata Madana Jangali that feeling comes when I sing this composition. I feel that Agra, that particular aspect of Agra comes out very well in this. As you know, there are other compositions which you'll eventually hear uh, that evoke Jaipur, that evoke Dagarwani,
Sure, sure.
that evoke, I don't know, whatever that tarana is. But every composition, the composition can be written from the perspective of a gaiki. The rag is larger than a, and so I know there are certain rags associated with certain gaiki, certain gharanas. I think it's incumbent on musicians who are serious searchers of the music to think about how those ragas morph into their gaiki without changing the rag.
I think with that, we've covered the topics that we had planned to cover with the raga. We'll open the floor for any questions that you may have.
Yes, please.
So this is a very general question about articulate rags, but since we're talking about this one in particular, do you have a sense of, because it seems to have inherently, at least in your interpretation, so much richness. Why would it be sung so rarely if it existed at one point, and why? Now, I understand that Vimpalasi is very appealing, but why would this just vanish?
It's one of these questions where I can get up on my soapbox and hold forth for 2 hours, but I won't, in the interest of time. What I would say is the music is subject to the same kinds of pressures that popular music is, that Carnatic music is. That any musical form that we can think of in India is subject to these same pressures. And what are those pressures? The pressure essentially comes from the fact that there is no longer a strong patronage system, and the old patronage systems were defined by um, individuals and institutions that um, wanted to intellectually understand the music, right? Whatever we want to say about Rajas and Maharajas, they were serious about their trying to understand their music. Um, you know, Historically, historians will poo-poo somebody like Muhammad Shah Rangila. I would say Hindustani music would not exist if not for Muhammad Shah Rangila, right? So these individuals were very serious about trying to understand the music at a very deep aesthetic level. That's largely gone away. So the patronage now comes from concerts. And just like Bollywood, just like any popular form of music, just like Carnatic music, it's that which is familiar which audiences want, right? So the very sad thing about this is where I need to not get on my soapbox, is uh, the shrinking audiences that we deal with in Hindustani music have an understanding of the music which is very small and very limited, right? The popular audience maybe understands dozen, 18, 24 rags, 25 rags, max, right? And these rags don't come in that list. So at some point you get tired of the Vimpalasis and Purya Danashis and Maru Bihags and the Madhuvantis. And when you're searching for real music, those rags go by the wayside. And then you come across things like this that provide very deep, aesthetic, rich experiences, like you said, but are not look at that are understood by a very small number of people. Um, is it incumbent on those of us who can sing and play instruments at a very high level to bring these rags forward? Yes, but who will do it, right? I mean, you risk your career as a performing musician if you do too much of this on stage.
So your answer was really about articulate rags in general, uh, not this rag, right? So what you're saying is it applies very broadly. So it, are there things that characterize a rag like this or other rags of this kind that make them more likely to be the ones that go by the wayside, right? Because it's not that this is so heavy that people cannot
Correct.
heavy virga, heavy
I don't have a good answer for you. I what I do think is because is what I do think is that um, the system of rags is not well explored. So there are these corners that if people invested and decided not to sing Puriya Dhanashri but sing Abhir instead, decide not to sing Maru Bihag but sing Abhir instead, audiences would enjoy, but it's too much of a chance. And so that unexplored corner remains unexplored.
Am I allowed to ask one more
Yes.
follow-up? So, in terms of, even if you go back to the days where there was patronage, are you, if only one written composition exists to this day, is your hypothesis that there were actually many compositions and they vanished, or is it possible that even quite a while back there was only
It's hard to say. Either of those possibilities is possible. It's hard to say. The vanishing of compositions, of course, as you know, we've talked about this in the past. It happens because repertoires were limited to where the transmission of repertoires was limited to selected individuals, and compositions vanished, rags vanished. Um, is Abhir one of those rags? Possible, or it's possible that Bhatkandi found it in South India and felt like it had scope to be a North Indian rag and wrote this composition. It's hard to know which of those is the case.
Is it required to repeat the question which you just answered?
The question was, correct me if I'm wrong, um, a rag like Abhir provides such a rich aesthetic experience. Is there a particular reason why it has not been popularized to date? Does that capture it? Yeah.
This particular rag. Okay,
so broadly about
sure.
and in particular about this one?
Broadly about Aprachalit ragas, but in particular, yeah.
So we have a question from our online viewer. Do you feel like so you have written a series of compositions spanning rags, I mean, spanning tals within this rag, aside from the literature that's already there. From what you've written and how you've performed it, do you feel that the Chota composition from the recording brings out a different aspect of Abhir that is less or more prominent in the Jhata? And if so, what aspect?
This is such a good question. Um,
There's more.
if you'll notice in the Chautal, Morat dekh binu, the first nyas is on Ma. So the allusions are to Asavari. Those of you who have studied Asavari with me realize that I look at it very differently than Jaunpuri, right? So these are all Asavari phrases. Mohe, that's the first look at Vimpalasi. Mohe kajuna bhave toma. So the only time that I am doing an Arohi phrase is when Krishna is being extolled. Toma ho Govardhana Giridhari. Otherwise, we're all falling. Hamajas Papi Bo Jana Bhare. So Asavari is much more dominant in that composition than Bhimpalasi. Sangaliye is very Bhimpalasi Dhanashri oriented. Yeah?
Okay. Okay.
Does that answer the question, whoever asked it? If not, please write back. Of course, it was
So just to follow up to that, so then maybe not across gharanas, but across different styles of the same rag, there is going to be a difference in the weight of proportions of Anwar Jod rags in
Sure.
that. So in the gharana side, on the gharana side, the answer wasn't so much that it wasn't that case?
It gets towards the fundamental nature of talim, so I won't answer that question further.
Okay.
But
Okay.
yeah,
Okay. Um, hmm. Are there any connections between Abheri and Abheri Todi and in your research and
And
reflections?
reflections on a very, did you ever refer to a very story to understand Abhiri Raj?
ah, no, they're very different rags. They are very different rags. Um, I'm not well equipped to discuss Abheri Todi today, but I will make it a point. Whoever asked that, I'll make it a point to get back to you. Was that Akhil? No. Yeah.
Yes.
Akhil, I'll get back to you.
So I think that thank you so much.
Sure.
That concludes today's. Are there any other questions before I definitely?
I want to know whether this belongs to a very particular season, this you talked about the craft or
Oh, okay. So the
Yes.
question is just for documentation. The question is, does this belong to a particular season? Does it belong to a particular time of day? Okay. I think that when I'm singing the rag as I did in the recording, I'm not following the Parsa um, Vadi Samvadi uh, stipulation that's in Subbarao, right? Because it's more, uh, I know you think not, but there's a very strong flavor of Asavari in it, right? So if it were to be a Dhanashri Ang Raga, right, then it's kind of an afternoon raga. But if it were to be an Asavari Ang Raga, it's a morning raga. So I would place this as a late morning, early afternoon raga. Yeah, it's a late morning, early afternoon raga. Does it belong to a season? No, it not per se. Abhir alludes to um, a tribe that is associated with Krishna, right? Milkmen, milkmaids, cowherds. So one can loosely say it's kind of like a springtime, holy kind of, but I don't get that feeling out of it. But the name itself is a Krishna, a Vaishnav name. Does that answer your question?
That's the last question. So would you say that going back and kind of doing the scholarly work to understand rags like these, to sort and then sort of recreate and imagine what they might be and explore angles of music through exploring rags like this is another way of actually just infusing music, Hindustani music in general, with sort of new old ideas or however you want to call it. But it, rather than just creating a brand new rag, which is one way of infusing music with new things, this is another way of actually bringing in something new. What is sort of what is your opinion on the role that this might play in sort of infusing creativity and then preventing things from being too static?
Okay. So the question has to do with um, sort of the vibrancy of the music. And what Murli is saying is that one has many ways of trying to make the music uh, creative and um, living, I guess. Um, and the two ways that Murli suggested is one can try and create one's own ragas, or one can try and revive what is there. So, in my humble opinion, very few new ragas have succeeded. And when we say success, right, that's usually measured in terms of a raga breaching gharana gaiki identities, right? So a rag like Jokons has proliferated across gharanas and gaikis. It's gone into Drupad, it's in Khayal, obviously, and therefore it can be considered to be a successful new rag. It's no longer a new rag, but it, relatively speaking, on the scale of things, a new rag. Such rags are very few, very, very few. And it turns out, with all due respect to Jagannath Bua, it's not an original creation. That same scale exists in the literature under the name Gangeya Bhushan, and it is sung in Drupad. It is a very important rag of Drupad. So, and it's definitely there in Carnatic music also. So, therefore, what one can say about all this is that no matter how great our understanding of music and no matter how deep our scholarship, there's very little that remains untouched by a human mind, right? There's not much that one can really come up with that's new, and the stuff that one comes up with is so odd, right? That it has no chance of viability. So, let alone cross gharana um, proliferation, I think the other standard of whether something is good or not is whether it lasts for 3 generations of musicians, and very few of these do. So, therefore, having said all that, creating new ragas is not something that I consider to be a viable pathway for keeping the music alive and growing. On the other hand, the factors that I discussed earlier have meant a shrinking number of ragas that are being performed on stage. This is exacerbated by the fact that our performances are typically evening to late night. And so a very small subset of ragas is performed. And, at some point I will talk about my belief on the time system and how we've got it exactly backwards. But putting that aside, um, the because there's a shrinking number of ragas that is sung, the number of ragas that are out there that remain unexplored or have not been recently explored is growing, and it keeps growing. And that's where the creativity lies. That is where the creativity lies. And especially if you have a situation where you have a very skeletal framework like you do with Abhir, then a musician's thinking, a musician's creativity, a musician's approach to aesthetics can truly make something amazing, fantastic. That's what I want to do. That's what I believe is the viable pathway to a healthy, vibrant art form.
You're also suggesting that more and more ragas that might have been until recently sung more often are susceptible to becoming
Aprachalit.
prachalit.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And that's very clear if one looks at the repertoire um, of musicians, um, 20, 30, 40 years ago was much greater. Number of rags that were being sung were much greater. The number of interpretations of the same rag were much greater. And one of the things we will explore is just a sneak peek. I, the next thing we will tackle, the next raga we'll tackle is rag abhogi, right? And those of you who are familiar with this music are going, what's the big deal about abhogi? Everybody knows, sa re ga ma da sa, sa da ma ga re sa. Everybody knows it. Well, that's not the whole story. there are
So,
there are multiple versions of that raga. Some of them completely unexplored, and clearly, since there's a compositional repertoire, they used to be sung, and now it's not.
So even in the Carnatic system, they had many, many different versions of the same raga.
No, this particular set so one of them comes from Carnatic music and the other does not. Carnatic music, there's a limited number of cases of this, and it has to do with you probably know, the Tyagaraja and Dikshita Sampradaya have different nomenclatures and slightly different definitions of rags. That's where that comes from. It's very well defined that this is what's happening. Hindustani music is a whole different kettle of fish. Sorry, apologies to the vegetarians.
guess that concludes it for the first chapter of the Ragadari series. Thank you once again, Guruji, for having this session with us. All these lectures and all this information will be available on YouTube very, very soon. And on that note, we hope to see you all at the next lecture that will happen, and you will all be informed about that through email. So, on that note, thank you very much and have a good night.
She cracked the code. That didn't take long, did it?
But we missed.
And when we're still live, it's the same. Yes, see, that is.
I know.
Oh no, his bone was hidden behind my back, so. Yeah.
You kept trying to find things to show off.
Until you gave them all of the stuff to chew.
Until he realized it's too much for him to chew.
Then they fell asleep.
He's taken a bite too big to chew.
Thank you all.
Thank you. That was really good.
Stay tuned for the next post.
Nee, विसरले होते. ह्या weekend ला बोलला आमच्याकडे. त्यामध्ये
Well, this one will hopefully go up.
Even just even during work.
Each rag that we do.
I mean, you'll be okay saying no yet, but if you would any kind of Wednesday after midnight session,
Anytime.